with you a story of one of my close friends who is also an Al-Maghrib student, also from the Qabila Ittihad. He told me this last year and really kind of shook me because it was just so powerful, subhanAllah. At the time he was 18 years old. Several years ago, 18 years old, a freshman in university, and its first time attending, his first semester in college. He was taking loans to pay for his tuition, and he had an internship that paid him around $400 a month, and it was a 3-month internship. And so he was attending a fundraiser in which the speaker, he kept telling the audience, have confidence in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just believe and have confidence in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah promises you that when you give something, whatever you give for the sake of Allah, Allah gives it back to you. Whatever it is that you give, He gives it back to you. Right? And so the speaker was really inspiring the crowd and motivating the crowd. And I'm sure you've attended fundraisers like that before. We were just like, man, if I had, whatever I had, I would give it. Just drop it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But a lot of us, oftentimes, we don't have much. And he was like that. He didn't have a car. He was taking the bus to get to school. He was taking loans to pay for his university. He barely had a job that could cover his basic living needs at the time. And so the speaker said, $25,000 for the sake of Allah. Who has confidence in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And nobody raised their hand. Nobody's pushing the crowd. Nobody's raising their hand. So he comes down to $10,000. He comes down to $10,000 and again he says, have confidence in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who will give $10,000 for the sake of Allah? And so the brother's looking around and he sees no hand going up. He sees not a single hand. And so he says, he's like, man, he was just inspired by the words. And he says, I believe in the promise of Allah. Allah says, وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ قِيلًا. Who is more truthful in speech than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So when Allah says, whatever you give, He will give back to you and He'll multiply that by many fold, there's no doubt. It's a guarantee. So, right? He's like, man, I'm going to raise my hand. And so he described it like he felt like shivers going down his back. Right? He started to feel a little weak and shaky. But he starts looking at his hand and his hand's and it goes up and he raises his hand for $10,000. So the people in the audience, the Dr. Saabs and everybody else are like, what? Like, this guy, 18 years old, a freshman in college, dropping $10,000? For real? And the sheikh was like, takbir and all, the whole thing. And he gave $10,000. And those of you who've given something significant before where you're not sure if you really can afford it, but you're going to make it happen one way or another, you might have experienced something similar, where you just feel like you feel shaky, you're nervous, you start sweating. SubhanAllah, the ayah, الشَّيْطَانُ يَعِدُكُمُ الْفَقْرَ وَيَأْمُرُكُمْ بِالْفَحْشَاءِ, you experience it. The shaitan promises you poverty and commands you the evil and wicked deeds. But Allah promises you, first He says, forgiveness and then also His bounty in return. So he pledged the $10,000. He goes home and he tells his mom what he did. His mom says, call them right now. Cancel the donation. It's like, are you kidding me? Where are you going to come up with $10,000? But he talked to her, he explained to her the same inspiration he received. He shared that with his mom and he said, I'm sticking with this. I committed to $10,000. I'm going to come up with it one way or another. SubhanAllah, he got a phone call a few weeks later from a brother in the community who calls him and tells him, you know what, your undergrad education, not just this semester, but your whole undergraduate education, don't worry about it anymore. I'm taking care of the whole thing. His whole undergraduate education paid for. He was taking loans that would have caused him to pay interest. Right? So he was saved from interest and all his tuition was paid for. And he says, instead of taking the bus, I'm going to buy you a brand new SUV. He bought him a brand new SUV. And then once he graduated from undergrad, he paid for his master's as well. SubhanAllah. The brother told me this almost literally a year ago to today. It was in the end of December. He said that, SubhanAllah, it's been almost like 7-8 years and it's been over $250,000 worth later and I'm still benefiting from that decision I made 7 years ago. When you believe in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, regardless of what you perceive to be your means at the time, you push yourself for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you find the promise of Allah to be true.